Hey there, and welcome to CreativeBackgrounds.net. And this is the very first After Effects tutorial for 2014. And for that matter, the first After Effects tutorial on our CreativeBackgrounds.net website. Today what we're going to create is a very interesting motion background featuring Trapcode Particular. And as you can see, I'm going to go ahead and drop the resolution because this is what we're going to be making today. And if I drop the resolution, you can kind of get an idea of what we're going to make. It's a lens flare in the middle with a textured background followed by a particle system animated in 3D space. So let's go ahead and get started here. I'm going to create a new comp. So I'm going to go to File, New Project. And I'm going to save that for now since that's like our previous one. Go to Composition and then go to New Composition. I'm going to go with the 1080, 1920 by 1080 format, 30 frames per second. And let's set the resolution to full for now. And then typically I'll do 30-second background loops, but in order to make it seamless, I usually make it 38 seconds. And during the 8 seconds, that's when I'll show you guys how to make that seamless, possibly in a different tutorial. Go ahead and click OK. First thing we're going to want to do is right-click and click New, Solid. And we're just going to simply make this our background layer. Next, we want to give that color, that background layer some color, so we're going to create New and Solid and name this Ramp. Now, after you click Enter, go ahead and go Generate Ramp. There it is. And what we're going to do for this tutorial is I'm going to go with black on the end color, and then for the start color I'm going to go with the dark red. And just to generate this really fast, we're going to make this a radial ramp. I'm going to move the bottom pin down and center up the starting point, so that way it kind of fills up the screen with a nice solid gradient. Right about there. Okay, so now we got the background. What we want to do next is we want to create the lens flare. So I'm going to use a third-party plugin called Optical Flares. If you don't have it, you can go to videocopilot.net, which is the premier website for After Effects tutorials. And they do have that plugin for, I think it's $89. You can buy that plugin. First of all, though, what we need to do is create a new layer. So let's go to New, then Solid. And then you can name this whatever you want. I'm just going to go with Optical. And once you have that layer, make sure that layer is selected, go to Effects. Then under Video Copilot, you can go under Optical Flares. Now this is going to bring up a default blue flare here. We're going to actually go to the Options panel. And we're going to load that, the Optical Flares option panel, and we're going to go to Presets. Then go to Motion Graphics, and I've already got one picked out. I'm going to go down to this one right here. Looks pretty good. And I'm going to just remove a couple of the circles really fast here. I don't really think that adds too much to it. And there we go. Then I'm going to click OK. Alright, so now we got our basic lens flare. If you click on those center points, you can kind of move it around to get an idea for what it looks like. That looks pretty cool. But what we want to do is it's too sharp, and we want to kind of blur that effect. So what we're going to do is under the Optical Flares options panel, right now the render mode is on black. We want to change that to on transparent. So now you can see the background that we've created right behind it. So now we've got our lens flare, or the optical lens flare, on the background. Next, what we want to do is go to Effects, Blur, and then let's place a radial blur. Now, what I sometimes do is turn off the radial blur just so it renders fast, because if you put on a heavy blur, that'll take up most of your computer's resources trying to process each frame of this video. However, if you basically get your settings just the way you want it, I'm going to do for the amount, I'm going to go with the +20. And that's going to kind of blend it nicely. I'm going to leave that radial blur on for now, and then I'm going to turn it off in just a moment here. For the scale, I'm going to increase that to 120. And as you can see, it's already slowing down a little bit. So we've got a nice solid lens flare. Now, what you can do in your timeline, make sure your sequence timeline indicator is all the way to the far left. And we're going to create a couple keyframes here. Under flicker, I usually give it about an 8 and then a 9 for the actual amount and speed. And what that'll do, it'll give it a little bit of animation. But to give it more animation, we're going to click on the stopwatch for animation evolution. And then if you go to the end of your comp, and I usually give that about 8 revolutions. And what that'll do, it'll just animate that lens flare nice and neat. Just give it a little motion. Not very much, but just enough to let you know it's moving. Alright, at this point, let's go ahead and drop the resolution down to a quarter because we're going to need to be able to scrub through this and we don't want to wait all day for it to render. So, at this point, go ahead and right click and create new solid. And this is where we're going to get into another third-party plugin called Trapcode Particular. And we can just name this Trapcode. You can name it however you want to in order to keep your project organized. I'm going to go with Trapcode, and then once again we're going to go to Effects, Trapcode, and then Trapcode Particular. Now, if you scrub the timeline, you see the default Trapcode Particular particles fluttering from the center of the screen moving outwards. We're going to make a few adjustments to the emitter and to the particle system itself. First off, what I prefer to do is increase the life to about 45 seconds. And we'll just leave that right about there. And a neat little trick, you see how it starts with nothing and grows? Well, if you're going to do a seamless rotation, that's not going to work. So what you can do is you can take your actual layer, slide it down to the very beginning, and then increase the layer. So that way, when you're at the very beginning of your video, you don't really have a beginning point. It just keeps going, and that's where it starts. Now we need to make a lot more adjustments in order to make this look actually decent. Under opacity over life, you got several presets on the side. I like doing the hill preset, so it starts off with 0 opacity, builds up to 100%, and then the particle eventually dies out near the end. I'd like to take this a step further and actually create my own diagram of this. So I'm going to shave off the beginning of this graph and kind of give it a much more gradual entrance. Under opacity random, I'm going to increase that to 100%. And then finally, size, I'm going to drop that down to a 4.5. Size random, this is up to you. This is just kind of take some creativeness on your part, whatever you like. I'm going to go with 50%, so that way there's a little randomness in there. So this is starting to look pretty good. Now one thing you notice as you scrub through the timeline, they're moving pretty fast. So we can go up to the velocity. And if we drop the velocity down to say 70%, it's going to bring a lot more particles in because they're dispersing a lot less faster. So that brings us up to the particles near the top. I'm going to drop this down to 50. And that's going to decrease the particles to give it a much more natural look, as if you were flying through space. The velocity random, I do usually turn that up to about 50 as well. And I may even drop my particle systems down to about 30, just because I don't like too many particles overwhelming the background. So this is starting to look pretty good. You can kind of see where we're going with this animation here. Now what we got to do is take these particles and make them blend into the background. There's a couple ways of doing that, but before we get to that, I want to bring in a textured background, and then this will set the stage for what else we need to do. So I've got a great textured background here. I'm going to bring this in. I'm going to use this one right here. So we've got our textured background. Go ahead and drop that on there. And this textured background can be purchased at a royalty-free website. And we're just going to scale this down just a little bit, right about there. That looks pretty good. And with that textured background selected, I'm going to move my cursor to the very beginning of the timeline, and we're just going to erase the outer edges. So I'm going to take the eraser tool, double-click the layer, and then painting with white, that makes it transparent, I'm going to just paint around the outside edges here, in one little dot in the middle. So that kind of is going to erase some of the outside edges. Now if we go back to our comp, and then we switch that to overlay, you get a very cool background. It's a little dark for me, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring down the options panel for that textured layer and go to transform, and then drop that opacity down to 50%. And that's starting to look pretty good. It's just got a nice little texture in there. Our lens flare is still shining through in the center very brightly. Now we can go back to the particle system, as we need to get those white particles to blend in with the red background. So how we're going to do that is we're going to take our Trapcode layer and we're going to change that to overlay. Now you may initially think they disappeared, so what we're going to do is there's a simple fix to this. You take your Trapcode layer and duplicate it multiple times. The more times you duplicate it, the brighter they get, because they're overlaying on top of each other, creating a very nice glow. And then we can bring this back to full resolution here to kind of see how this is going to end up. As it renders out, now it's going to render very slow with that lens flare on. But you can see you've got a nice gradient background, red texture with a nice sharp glowy particle system with a lens flare in the middle. A very nice motion background, and it took us roughly just a couple minutes to generate this. If you want to see more motion backgrounds, I encourage you to go to creativebackgrounds.net, and there are hundreds of high-quality texture backgrounds that you can use for your productions. They're all royalty-free, and they're all very cheap, so check them out now. Thanks for watching.